In the 3rd century BCE, a philosopher called Zeno of Citium studied under the Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes. Drawing on the philosophical principles that he learnt, Zeno went on to establish his own school of philosophy. Zeno taught at the Stoa Poikile, which means painted porch, a colonnaded area to the north of the Agora in Athens. Zeno taught in this open and public place because he could not afford the formal school buildings of the Platonists or the Peripatetics. It is from this first teaching place that his school went on to establish its name, Stoicism. Equally important to the development of Stoicism was the third head of the Stoic school, Chrysippus of Soli. He wanted to expand the detailed corpus of writings on physics, logic, and ethics, which he then systematized into Stoic thought, earning him the title of the second founder of Stoicism. All three parts of Stoic philosophy are necessary to understand its thought: physics, logic, and ethics. A metaphor used to describe the interconnected nature of these different treatises is that physics is the fertile field, logic the fence, and ethics the bountiful crop. In Stoic physics, the universe is seen as a single, divine, pantheistic God. This God is active, rational, and creative. It is also self-supporting and containing everything else. Everything from natural phenomena to human conduct are manifestations of this all-pervading reason of God, also called Logos. In this Stoic conception of the universe, the eternal Godhead exists as an island universe, surrounded by a void. Similarly to Aristotle, the Stoics saw the universe as finite, in opposition to the Epicureans. The question then to the Stoics lay as such: who was this God? They identified God with Zeus as the ruler and upholder of law and the universe. They similarly incorporated the other gods of the Olympian pantheon as aspects of this same divine Godhead. They then argued that Zeus ordered the world in the best of possible ways, with every element of the universe unfolding in the most appropriate and rational manner. With this base underlying concept of the best of all universes, the Stoics accepted tragedy and suffering as necessary but not definitive aspects of reality. With this in mind, the Stoic adopted a somewhat fatalistic theological perspective. If everything happens for a reason and was destined to occur because of the prime mover, being Zeus, then the universe appears to be determined in its outcome. However, the Stoics did not want to do away with the common sense understanding of free will, and as such stated that free will exists because human decisions impact upon the great causal web of interaction independent with all these other causes. Despite not necessarily controlling the outcome of any particular event, we can still control the way that we think and choose with regards to these events. This appears, in fact, to be one of the first attempts at establishing a compatibilistic position on the issue of free will in the Western tradition. Moving back to the universe, in the Stoic conception of cosmology, the universe was initially undifferentiated. The original state was essentially a sphere of primitive divine substance, called pneuma, which was the active part of God's rationality, or logos. However, the tension and potentiality in this substance caused it to separate out into force and matter. The rational principle of God, logos, which has been slumbering in a dormant state, thus springs into action and begins to work its creative task on matter. This is the fundamental duality that is the core of Stoic physics: active logos and passive matter. Unlike the early atomists or the Epicureans, the Stoics held that matter was continuous in structure and was held together with tension, or tonos, which was a property of pneuma. The physical qualities of objects, such as heat, hardness, and brightness, were merely different currents of tension through the structure of the pneuma. From the passive matter separating out into the four elements, the Stoic system formed a basic component of matter. However, it was with the pneuma that the cohesion and contact between matter occurred, and as such, there was no individual separation between any one object throughout the universe. When it came to the more complex issue of metaphysics, the Stoics adopted a materialistic approach, rejecting Platonic idealism. This stance included the idea that there was a physical version of such abstract ideas as justice, wisdom, and goodness. However, they also recognized some non-corporeal objects, such as place, void, and time, but argued that they subsisted rather than existed. The Stoic soul was thus a material object. The Stoics argued that the soul was the most pure manifestation of pneuma in rational creatures, and a manifestation of the world soul which existed in the pantheistic Zeus. The soul was thus a reflection of the divine rationality which ordered the universe, and it was the impressions of sensation on the soul which led to cognition. The Stoics debated what happened to the soul after death, but it seems that there was an agreement that all souls would eventually return to the world soul from which they originated. The Stoics did not think the current world was eternal, but instead concluded that the universe would eventually decay and return back to its original state of pure potentiality. This would be achieved through a great fire, called ekpyrosis, before the God universe once again embarked on a new cycle, called apalingenesis. In this model, the universe would be created in the exact same way every time, because once again, Zeus is creating the most perfect universe possible. And so we see a cycle which is identical to all previous infinite iterations, much like Nietzsche's conception of infinite recurrence. One thing that is important to remember throughout Stoic physics is that no matter how complex and numerous the parts and functions become, the universe is not separated into numerous sections or objects, but is still overall incorporated into a single, all-pervading divine object. Having examined Stoic physics, the field, we shall now turn to Stoic logic, the fence. Stoic logic was a major competitor to Aristotelian logic for some time, but towards the end of the classical period it fell out of favour, and as such no direct writings on Stoic logic survive. However, aspects of the logical system can be gleaned from other works. Stoic logic was a very broad category in comparison to the narrow remit of term logic or Aristotelian logic. It encompassed such areas as rhetoric, grammar, language, and the study of knowledge, also called epistemology. Unlike the Epicureans, the Stoics believed that there was both false and true impressions, rather than holding that the illusions came from the mixing of material impressions in the mind. However, this led to an issue. If you accept there is false impressions, how can you know the truth? The Stoics argued that there was such thing as a cognitive impression, which arose wholly from a real and tangible object, for example, not a hallucination, and which conformed wholly to the object which emitted them, as in it was not misperceived as something else. The Stoics then argued against skepticism by stating that, with proper training, an individual could learn to differentiate between what was false and what was true by using these cognitive impressions. This builds into a broader idea in Stoicism which undergirds much of their philosophy, the idea of progress and development, called prokope. This idea of progress in the face of illusion becomes a point of contention between the Stoics and the academic skeptics. An example of this is a story which is given about a Stoic who attends a banquet. At the banquet, he sees a waxen model of a bird, which is incredibly lifelike, and he reaches out to pick it up, having believed it to be a real bird, and only realizes after having touched it that it is in fact a model. He's then accused of having assented to a false impression. To this, the Stoic replies that he had merely believed in the proposition that it was reasonable to think of objects as actually birds, not to the stronger claim that the object itself was a bird. When looking at those aspects of Stoic logic which accord with our modern and more limited definition, a generalization could be made. The Stoics used the proposition as the most basic component of logic rather than the term, which was much more the case with Aristotelian logic. They then divided these propositions into two classes, sayables and assertables. The former are a broad category that includes assertables as well as questions, imperatives, oaths, invocations, and even curses. The assertables are self-complete sayables that we use to make statements. For example, if Zeno is in Athens and then Zeno is in Greece, is a conditional composite assertable constructed out of two individual assertables, which are Zeno is in Athens and Zeno is in Greece. Interestingly, the Stoics held that although the proposition held a truth value, being either true and false, that this value could change over time. For instance, in the previous example, Zeno could be in Athens today, but not tomorrow. Although Stoic logic and physics are important to understand their worldviews, the Stoics themselves saw these two disciplines as guardians protecting the true jewels of the tradition, the Stoic system of ethics. The Stoics arrived to a similar view to the other Greek philosophies since Aristotle regarding the ends of human life. This common view was that the goal of life was happiness, but the issue of contention between the different schools was what happiness actually meant. The simplest formulation of the various working definitions deployed by the Stoics throughout the centuries was that true happiness was living life in accordance with nature. However, we must be careful because the Stoics use the term happiness here in a manner quite different from the ordinary use. The best way to conceive of Stoic happiness is through understanding what the Stoics meant by good, because it was a commonly held axiom by all Hellenic philosophers that which was genuinely good brought happiness. The Stoics rejected commonplace ideas of the good, such as health and wealth, by stating that which is good must be good in all circumstances. In this case, wealth could lead us into addiction, and a healthy physique could lead us into vanity. The Stoics referred to these ideas and things as indifferent. They were neither good nor bad. Here, they reject the more ascetic ideas of the cynics while still accepting the critique of commonplace hedonism. So what is good if it is not common pleasure? The Stoics argued that all animate things were driven by their soul towards an impulse which was appropriate for them. This was because the Stoics believed that the pantheistic Zeus existed as the driving force within all creatures, and rationality drove them towards their true purpose. Because the Stoics believed that humans were rational creatures as opposed to other beasts, more things were appropriate to us compared to other animals. Although, like all animals, we require nourishment and shelter, as we developed, we would begin to realize other things were more appropriate to us as humans. Thus, the Stoics put forward an evolutionary approach to impulse, which saw us first attracted to food and warmth, then to society and company, and finally towards moral goodness. To the Stoics, this moral goodness was the highest good, and if the human developed appropriately, they would come to recognize that this impulse towards morality and to goodness is of a different order compared to the previous desires. In fact, we would eventually come to recognize it as the only good. So, if moral goodness is the highest aim in Stoic ethics, then how do we best attain it? The Stoic ethics, grounded in their pantheistic and deterministic metaphysics, argues that we should live in agreement with nature. The argument goes that because God is good and the moving factor in the unfolding of the universe, we should choose to live in accordance with the appropriate impulses of our life. The most important aspect of this is the choice, which includes the rational selection of those things which contribute to true happiness. In this sense, the Stoic highlights the rational internal over the physical actual unfolding of the choice. This is because the rational part is the closest to the pantheistic God's rationality. However, if we fail to attain the aim of our choice, we should be indifferent to its outcome. With this in mind, the practicing Stoic would choose rational goods, food when they are hungry but not to excess, wealth and public office when it suited them but not by compromising their morals, and if necessary, suicide to avoid corrupting their highest moral goods. However, if our aims are frustrated, the Stoic argues not to be concerned, because in reality, the world is the best of all worlds because of the pantheistic God. And for the Stoic, the only thing we can control is our choices, not the outcomes of these choices. In this sense, we can think of the Stoics as free will compatibilists because even though they accepted a deterministic universe, they argued for control over our own mentality. For them, our own emotions were themselves also a choice. Here we can begin to understand the Stoic conception of emotion. Because we choose with only a fragment of complete knowledge when compared to the world soul, which guides the world along its course, our choices will not always accord with their desired outcomes. Although moral goodness is defined by our choices, we have no ownership of anything beyond these choices. Thus, the Stoic argued that we should consider everything beyond our choices as being on loan, including success, wealth, health, friends, family, and our very lives. In the face of nature, we will often have these choices frustrated or overturned, and we will feel a desire to be angry or sad. Similarly, in the faces of victory, however temporary, we will feel pride, elation, and happiness. However, for the Stoics, these emotions led to inevitable mental disturbances and suffering. They did not necessarily reject emotions, as the common parlance understands Stoicism may suggest, but argued that it must be controlled. This is where the Stoic concept of Apatheia comes into being. This is similar to the cynic pursuit of ataraxia and means a dispassionate or unaffected by the passions worldview. To the Stoics, emotion was a choice, and as such, with much of their ethics, we choose to be mad, sad, or glad. Therefore, the Stoic ideal was to choose not to experience these emotions and instead adopt the unperturbed position. However, the Stoics did not advise a life of withdrawal. In fact, they advised a full-throated engagement in the political world, advice taken to heart by many later Roman Stoics. Yet, one of the most interesting ideas of Stoic political philosophy has to do with cosmopolitanism. Unlike the earlier cynic cosmopolitanism, which was negative in its rejection of the polis, Stoic cosmopolitanism emphasized the oneness of humanity, which was at odds with traditional Greek ideas of superiority concerning their language and culture. Stoic cosmopolitanism can be divided into two main aspects: identity and responsibility. With regards to identity, the Stoics highlighted the eclectic nature of culture, coming from many peoples and influences. With this in mind, they suggested that an individual is free to experiment and take what they wanted from the cultures that they encountered, once again highlighting this emphasis on the choice. With regards to responsibility, the Stoics argued that the individual is a member not of a single polis or nation, but a global community of human beings, to which they owed allegiance. This attempted to erase the borders of the local and parochial community and place concerns of justice and fairness on a more global footing. Stoicism remained influential after this early Roman imperial phase, however, to a much less degree. Roman Christians were receptive to some of the ideas of Stoicism, although primarily from the ethical perspective. The ideas of Stoic metaphysics obviously were little considered from the perspective of the theologist who had already accepted Christian revelation. In the 16th and 17th centuries, during the Renaissance, a movement called Neo-Stoicism emerged, which attempted to merge aspects of both Christianity and Stoicism. Stoicism has also seen a revival in the modern era, with a particular focus on its therapeutic qualities and practical advice. From this, the writings of Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius have seen a wide readership from those seeking to live their life, so-called, in accordance with nature.